So there are a couple principles of natural selection. So natural selection just essentially states that some organisms will survive and reproduce better than others, causing changes in the population over time by acting on traits that are heritable. Okay, so heritable, so if we go back to our ideas with Lamarck was talking about inheriting acquired traits. So we do not inherit traits that have been acquired because those did not change our DNA. So only traits that are heritable, aka coded for in our DNA, are going to be acted upon by natural selection. So a population, again, is just a group of organisms of the same species. And so for natural selection to occur, some organisms would have to have some kind of trait encoded in their DNA that gave them some kind of selective advantage that would cause them to be able to survive and reproduce better than others without that trait. And so this would over time begin to cause big changes in the entire population because we would start to see more of that desired trait and less of the undesirable traits or the just not as fit traits. So when I say the word fit, I'm sure you've probably heard the term before, survival of the fittest. And so that is what, so survival of the fittest, that phrase is referring to natural selection, that the fittest organisms will be the ones that will survive and reproduce and pass on their genes to their offspring. Okay, so now actually let's get to the principles of natural selection. This is what natural selection is. Now there are a couple things that we need to know about it. So the first one is an overproduction of offspring. So this kind of sets the stage for allowing natural selection to occur. So when we have a lot of offspring, when parents have a lot of offspring, and as well as limited resources. So the earth is a finite place. There are a finite amount of resources, and that finite just means there is a set amount of resources. And inherently, if there's limited resources and a lot of offspring, there's going to be a lot of competition for those resources. And so this allows natural selection to kind of peak out, because if there was no competition for resources, then everyone would survive and everyone would pass on their genes regardless of if that trait was more desirable. Okay, so that's one of the first things that kind of sets the stage. The second is genetic variation. So variations are just differences in the physical traits of organisms. And as we've learned a couple sources of variation before. And so the first one, which is also known as the ultimate source, I'll tell you why in a second, is random mutation. So throughout the course of our life, there can be random mutations that will occur in our DNA. And if those mutations occur in our sex cells, in our gametes, then we will pass those mutations along to our children. And then so let's say if it's in a female gamete, one of my female gametes gets mutated, and then I have a child with someone, our genes will mix and commingle, and if I have a mutation in there, as well as I'm mixing my genes with their genes, on top of the fact that there's genetic recombination crossing over during meiosis, then and along with independent assortment of chromosomes, meaning that so half of my DNA will go in some of my gametes, half of it will go in the other, but which half that is just depends on the distribution of chromosomes at that time. And so all of that is increasing the amount of variation that we will see in that offspring. Okay, and then the third source of variation is something called migration or gene flow. And we're going to get into that in just a little bit, but it's just essentially when animals or organisms, they enter or leave their environment. So they migrate out or they migrate in. And so that will just cause a change in the gene pool or the available alleles in a population. And so the reason random mutations is known as the ultimate source is just because of the fact that it is a promoter of genetic variation in all organisms, regardless of the way they reproduce. And so what I mean by that is, since meiosis is only performed by animals that perform sexual reproduction, any bacteria or prokaryotic organisms that reproduce through mitosis, they do not perform meiosis, so there is no crossing over, and so there is no genetic recombination. And so, and this also, we also don't really see this in bacteria regarding gene flow. And so we just say random mutations are the ultimate source because it will increase genetic diversity across organisms, regardless of whether or not they reproduce asexually or sexually. Okay, the third principle that allows for natural selection are adaptations. And so an adaptation is a feature that allows an organism to better survive in its environment. And so the best adaptations will become more common over time because organisms should live longer and thus be able to reproduce more. And so this will cause a change in the gene pool, which is just the combined alleles, like I mentioned earlier, of all individuals in a population. So a feature that allows an organism to better survive in its environment would be an example of a cactus. So cacti actually perform photosynthesis a little bit different, and they do so in order to preserve as much water as possible, because since cacti are usually found in the desert, there's usually a scarcity of water. There's usually not a lot of water around, and so they actually have evolved over time. They have adapted to their environment and now perform photosynthesis in a way that will conserve as much water as possible. And then the fourth principle of natural selection is something called descent with modification. Oh, this little guy's so cute. Okay. And this just means that there is a change in gene frequency over time. So natural selection leads to populations with new phenotypes that are adapted to new situations. And so their traits come from their ancestors. And again, beneficial traits should become more common over time. So if we just see a change in gene frequency is just how often we see a gene occur in an organism in a population. So maybe the gene for, opposable thumbs, for example, is a big one. So we would begin to see a change in the number of we would begin to see a change in the gene frequency over time. We would begin to see, instead of only seeing maybe 10 organisms with thumbs, we would begin and maybe 100 without. There would be a shift, and we would see 100 organisms with opposable thumbs versus only 10 without at that point. And so it's when it gets to the point that they are able to pass it down from ancestor to all their descendants. And so this is when beneficial traits should become more common.